Hey, and welcome to Temple of Fallspot, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. Thanks for stopping by. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
And we got Professor Bruce, TA Bruce, there we go. Teacher's Assistant Bruce, here to teach us a lesson today. And I'll be the annoying kid in the back, being devil's advocate. We are talking today about land consistency. Land consistency. How many lands do you run in a deck? It's up to you, because you could not want to draw land, but that would make the game boring. But also, if you run too many lands, then you end up having a handful of spells a handful of land and no spells. There we go. I was like, I'm saying the same thing I just said. So, Bruce, why don't you take it away? You've got a little thesis for us.
Sure. So, when I started playing, the appropriate ratios were 1/3 creatures, 1/3 other spells, and 1/3 lands.
Whoa.
I recommend going with that. I think we're done.
Great.
All right.
Have a great night, and
Short
I hope your fifth
podcast.
land is the temple.
There we go. Or, well, I guess maybe we could talk about this a little more, because I think
I hope your sixth land is the temple.
I'd like to think we've evolved a little bit farther than that.
Seventh land?
I hope your fifth, sixth, and seventh lands are all temples. I mean,
Well, temples of some sort.
yes. What we're looking at is how many lands should be in your deck. And I'm going to take a guess and say right now, you are not running enough lands in your deck. And I'm not talking just to Andy, I'm talking to all of you out there. Every single one of you. You're probably not running enough lands in your deck. Now, I'm going to say right off the bat, you should be running 40. At least 40. Are you running at least 40?
No. I think I'm running 40 in... I've got, 7 or 8 decks? I think I'm running 40 in 2.
I have 14 commander decks.
Wow.
I don't have a single commander deck that's running less than 40. Not one. Because
Man of his word.
this is something that I truly believe will improve consistency in your decks. Too many of us don't get to play enough commander. So it's a crying shame when we get a starting hand that has 3 or 4 lands, say we're good to go, and then don't see another land turn after turn after turn. And you end up just sitting there doing nothing for almost an hour because you just never get back on level ground with everybody else who's playing. And that's just a hopeless setup.
That is my MO when I play Magic, though. And people always feel bad for me, and they never attack me. It's great. And then I come back and
if you
still
can,
lose.
Right, and if you can consistently pull that off, coming right back at the end only to just lose, then maybe that works for you.
Gets my heart racing.
But I'm going to suggest otherwise. So the reason I suggest 40 is when you look at your deck, consider what the key cards are in your deck. For most of us, it's going to be the commander. Sometimes there are other cards that are the key card, the card that really makes your deck hum. So, like in my case, let's just consider Griselda right off the bat. That deck runs based on Griselda. It absolutely does. The whole point is to tap Griselda, make these funky creatures, and go. So, Griselda is the key card. Griselda costs 5 mana.
Ooh.
Now, to me, this means I want to play the key card as fast as I can, because it's the key card of the deck. The longer it takes me to play this card, the more time I'm spending not doing what the deck is supposed to do. So I want to get it out there as fast as possible. So, when you look at Griselda, in this case, the key card in that deck is the commander, and it costs 5. Realistically, I want to be dropping a land every turn until I can get to that 5. So, in other words, I want to hit 5 land by turn 5. So, how do you do this? How do you get to 5 land by turn 5? Well,
You have them to begin with.
right. You can.
You put in 99 lands.
Exactly. 99 lands. By turn 5, you're going to have that land. No problem. Of course, you're not going to be able to do anything else with Griselda. You're going to rely on everybody else to put creatures in their graveyards. And that isn't quite as much fun as you might think. A little mix and match. So realistically, I do want to get the 5 lands by turn 5. Well, on what happens by turn 5? See, I start with 7 cards to start, and I'm going to draw at least 5 more. So, for sake of example, I'm drawing 12 cards. I need 5 lands in those 12 cards. A tiny bit of math says that I need 42 lands in my deck to reach that 5 out of 12 cards.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right, because that's the average. Now, because it's the average, it doesn't mean it's going to happen every time.
Yeah. I mean, just because you... Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if that's the halfway point... That's the average. That's the midpoint.
Right. Just because you're land screwed doesn't mean that you didn't put enough lands in the deck.
Right. Variance is a part of the game, and I get that. But I think it's a nice starting point. Now, there are other variables that can go into this. Obviously, you've included some ramp cards in your deck. So that can, in theory, reduce the number of lands you need because the ramp will get you there.
Right, and ramp is, I mean, anything that will get you more mana than the turn you're on, essentially.
Right. It essentially allows you to play that second land.
Right. I mean, even in a loose sense, like, mana rocks could be considered ramp because you're getting, say, 3 mana on turn 2.
Yes. Yeah. Using the term mana is probably better than saying land.
Right.
Just because, it shows where you are. Card draw, even to some extent, can also be used to cover for, fewer lands because you're drawing more cards. So in theory, then, by turn 5, maybe you haven't drawn 12 cards. Maybe you've drawn 15. So that can also reduce the amount of lands you need in the deck to get to 5 lands on turn 5.
Right, but you're also using your mana to do
that. This is just it. When you start looking at ramp, and you start looking at card draw as ways to get to the mana count that you need on turn 5 to be able to play your spell. Well, the ramp and the card draw are there to do other things. Trust me, you weren't putting ramp in your deck just to make the land drops. You were putting ramp in your deck to be way ahead. I mean, on turn 5, when you play that 5th land, you also want there to be a couple of mana rocks by then, so that you're not just producing the 5 mana from the lands, you're producing 6 or 7 mana. Because, I mean, yeah, I want to play Griselda on turn 5. I'd also then like to be able to play Greaves and equip it to Griselda, because you want to protect her. You want to play other spells. You want to play multiple spells on a turn, so you shouldn't be relying on your ramp or your card draw to supplement the fact that you decided that you think 36 lands or 30 lands or whatever number is the right number. It's not. You should be going with 40 plus lands.
Yeah, you don't want to end up using your mana to just make more mana to get to that one play. Like, you should be protecting yourself throughout and getting ready for that play, because honestly, if you don't have Greaves out because you have just been playing Cultivate, I mean, Cultivate's obviously not going to be in Griselda, but those types of cards, if you're only doing that for the first couple turns, like, you're leaving yourself open, and what am I trying to say?
You don't want to be using up all of your ramp just to be getting that 1 mana per turn. That should be the standard. That should be the basis of what you're looking at. So you want to go that route. Okay, now, so you're thinking to yourself, oh, okay, so I want to get Teysa out on turn 4. And there isn't anything else in my deck that I'm really all that worried about that costs more than 4. Well, okay. So Teysa on turn 4.
Pretty accurate.
Right. So Teysa on turn 4. Well, that means you're seeing 11 cards, and you want 4 of them to be land. So you're looking at 37 land. Now,
it's pretty accurate. I think I have 36.
Right. And I just finished saying you should have 40. And I'm still going to say you should have 40.
Oh, absolutely.
Because when I give you these numbers and say that that's what, based on the averages, that's what it should be, that's great. But let's look at the percentages, like the likelihood of actually drawing some of this stuff. Now, I'm not going to go through and talk endlessly about and just pound numbers on a podcast, because, man, there's nothing more mind-numbing than listening to somebody who's just spewing numbers.
Especially like percentages that are these ethereal, like...
Right.
Like, sure, we know you know how you got them, but, like, what does that mean in, like, for results? Like,
right.
I mean, regardless of the percentage, it's not 100%. So, therefore, like, I could very well have a game like I did last week with Tesa, where I get black market up to 59, and I have a land in hand still, and that's all I have.
Right. Oh, yeah. I mean, you can still get too much mana,
right.
But... I would argue that, yeah, exactly. I think that's a great problem to have as opposed to a bad problem. If the person talking about lands doesn't mention Frank Karsten's how many lands do you need to consistently hit your land drops, then it isn't being done properly. That article, Frank goes through and figures out what the percentages are, like what's the likelihood of hitting land drops at a certain point in time. And he uses a 60 card deck. Now, it's not that hard to extrapolate out. So I'm going to...
Plus 40, right?
Yeah. So I'm going to, just real quick, if you want 4 lands by turn 4, and you're playing with a commander deck, if you run the 36 lands that we were talking about, then you're going to hit that 4 lands 74% of the time. If you run the 40 lands that I recommend, you're going to hit it over 80% of the time. Now, I'll leave it to you to decide if that 6% is worth the extra 4 lands in the deck. I think it is, but that's the option. Now, if you're looking at, in my case with Grusilda, 5 lands by turn 5, even if you have 40 cards in your deck, you're only hitting that 64% of the time.
40 lands.
Yeah. So in Grusilda, because with me running 40, means that I'm only going to hit my 5th land drop on turn 5 2 out of every 3 games.
Yeah, and that's disregarding,
Yeah, now
mulligans.
You can, right, exactly. Now you can up those percentages by being, by being good with mulligans. Obviously,
is anyone good with mulligans?
Well, by being...
That's a discussion for another time.
Right. By at least being cognizant of what mulligans can do.
Right.
This has to happen. There are decks that should run fewer than 40. I just don't think there's very many of them. And I think there's far
they have to be
fewer.
Very aggressive, very low on the mana curve. And
considering most commander decks, even the high-powered ones where games end fast, they're still mana hogs. And I'm still convinced with those decks that you really do want a higher land count. Those decks are doing a ton of card draw to find so that allows you to find other things. So don't make it so that you're wasting it to find
land.
To find land.
Yeah.
So
you want to already have it, and
right. So
you don't want to. Yeah, you don't want to be using your card draw for lands, because that's a waste. No pun intended.
Well, yeah. I want you really want to be able to hit your lands, reliably without any other assistance. And to do that, you really need to up your land count. It's something. It really is something to keep in mind. Now, we mentioned mulligans a couple of times. When it comes to your land count, I mean, just the reason you're running 40 is so that you can hit that 4th land on turn 4, that 5th land on turn 5. So don't take your opening hand, look at it and say, oh, look, there's 2 lands, I'm good to go. You want to increase your percentage chance of getting that 5th land on turn 5 or the 4th land on turn 4. to do that, you need to have a good hand to start. I mean,
Yeah.
7 of the cards you're looking at, 7 of the 11 cards you're looking at are cards you already get to see before you even start the game. So make them count. I'm not saying you need all 4 lands, but I'm saying 3 sure can't hurt. And 2, well, if you're only keeping a 2 land hand and you're trying to get to 4 lands by turn 4, you're giving yourself 4 turns to find 2 lands. Well,
That's a 50-50 shot.
Right, and you were just balking.
Or,
and you were balking at the idea of making your deck 40% lands, but now you need it because now you're looking at you need 50% return. Like, don't be crazy.
Right.
Obviously, those aren't good odds. So you're already putting yourself in the hole. Mulligan properly. Don't be, yeah, I get it. There are times when you look at that 2 land hand and think to yourself, this is going to take me there.
And that also has to do with like the other cards in your hand as well.
It absolutely does. Because,
like if you're
2 lands and a soul ring,
yeah,
that's, you're looking at 4 mana on turn 2.
Also depends on how many colors you have. Like obviously there's all these edge cases, and we're talking generally here.
Right.
And with, say, 2 lands, try to make, like, if you're playing 2 colors, obviously try, like, if they're different colors, great. But also, like, look at the other cards in your hand. We'll get to mulliganing in another episode, probably next season. But it's a skill, obviously. And knowing how many land are in your deck will also lend you toward a smarter keep or throwing it back.
Well, exactly. I mean, just think of the percentages. 2 lands and a signet. Okay, so
you're not doing anything turn 2.
Turn 1, you play the land. Turn 2, you play a land and your signet.
Yeah.
Okay. So that means you've got 1, 2, 3 turns to get that 3rd land. Because you need that 3rd land. Because you're trying to hit that land on turn 3. Whether you've got that signet, whether you play the signet or not. Because you're not supposed to be relying on your ramp. And signet is a ramp to get you to 4 mana on turn 4. And keeping a 2 land hand with a signet is doing exactly that. Because the odds of you drawing 2 lands in 4 cards are not good. You're taking your chances. You're then leaning on your ramp to get you to where just the land in your deck should be getting you to. So, that's what I'm saying. So, quite often, what looks like a hand you should keep just isn't. I mean, I get it. And I'm as guilty as anybody. I mean, I just said 2 lands and a soul ring. I'm leaning towards keeping that. I don't know that I should be. Soul ring proves to be a nice buffer in case you don't get that land. But do you really want to?
But it also makes you a target.
Yeah, and it also means that if you're trying to get your cards out early and you're missing land drops, then the soul ring is just filling in for that.
Yeah.
Well, that's not why you want Soul Ring. You want Soul Ring because it's going to take you to 6 mana on turn 4. Not get you to 4, where you should have been anyway if you'd had the proper number of lands and mulligan properly. So, I'm not even touching on the idea of the colors that you need for the deck.
Right.
That's way beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about here. Because then you start looking at, are you running a 3-color deck, a 4-color deck? Are you running a deck that's very mana intensive? It's just the idea is, keep in mind that, your mulligan is one of your best tools. It really is, especially when it comes to making sure that you have the mana to actually play the game.
Yeah.
Don't look at your hand and think, oh, if I can just draw one more, if the next card is a land, I am set. Because the next card odds are, is not a land. Just keep that in mind. So many of the percentages that I've talked about here can be dramatically improved by good mulligans. You know, don't keep crap. And those same percentages can be way worse if you are keeping lousy hands. So
I think too, with giving yourself, 40, 42 as like your hard number, gives you this chance to really inspect the cards that you're actually putting in the deck. Because so many times when you're building a deck, you're going to be like, oh, this card I want to play, but maybe it's not necessarily good for the deck. So right. I'll just, I'll take out a swamp to put this card in. And it's like, well, hold up. Figure out why I want it in the deck, whether it's theme, if it's actually good, or something you just want to try.
And as somebody who has been consistently putting 40 lands in the deck, let me tell you, those last cuts are really, really tough. Because you're looking at 59 cards, not 62 or 63. You want 59 plus your commander.
Yeah.
And you're looking at these last handful of cards and saying, but I've only got 2 slots left, and I have 4 cards. And I just, you can't take one or the other. We need all 4 of them to make this work. And, if I go down to 38, wouldn't that be okay? That's still a lot of land. It'll be fine. No, it won't. It won't. Don't do this to yourself. Go with the 40. Make the hard cuts. If all 4 of those have to be in there, then go back through your deck list. Find something else that can come out. Something else can come out. You'll make it work.
It's funny because if you go back and listen to our episode about my Tesa deck, you'll hear that my first draft of that deck had 30 lands in it, which is extraordinarily small number. I would not recommend that. I have since bumped the number up to, I think, 37, let's say, because it's either 36 or 38. And I am still playing with it to figure out what needs to come out to bring that land back up.
Right.
But I lucked out with those first dozen games where I didn't necessarily meet a mana screw. But I definitely remember having, say, Command the Dreadhorde in hand and knowing I'm only at 5 and I've been at 5 for a few turns. And if I had just a few more land in my deck, I could play it. Granted, I also knew that it was turn, 7 or 8, and our games tend to run long because we're a generally lower powered meta. But even that early in the game for us, there wasn't much going on in the graveyard, so it was just the right the perfect storm of things where I was not worried about it. But since bringing the number up to 37, I have noticed just more consistency. Not necessarily better deck, but just more consistency. I have more things to do during the game than I did before. I can play things. I can do things on other people's turns. I mean, having the consistency, again, doesn't mean you have a good deck. It just means that you can play. And that's what you want.
Right. If I'm running my deck with 40 lands, and I reach a point in the game where I can't use all of the mana, then arguably I've put too much land in the deck. But practically speaking, it means that I've always got mana untapped. And as long as I've got some cards in hand, my opponents are always questioning, is he going to do something? Can he do something? What's in his hand? Can he play something? He's leaving a lot of mana open. What's he doing? even if I'm still holding a land in hand just because I got a little bit flooded, it's always there. It's always leaving my opponents wondering what's going on. If you're not if you're only running just enough to be able to cast Teysa, well, that's great. You cast Teysa, you're tapped out. Well, you're doing nothing while all of your opponents take their turn. And is Teysa going to manage to stay on the board the entire time? Well, there's nothing that you can do to stop anybody from doing anything about it. That's kind of the key. Suddenly now you're at the whim of everybody else on the board. It would be much better off if, you can play Teysa and still have a mana left over, even if you can't.
And I think that's kind of what it kind of comes down to, is like, it allows you to play the game, not only obviously your spells and the things in your hand, but it allows you to have some sort of strategy, skill, whatever. Like, you are playing the game in terms of, like, we talk about it all the time. You have a land in hand and you can make that land drop, but maybe you're good enough. Like, maybe you have enough land out. You don't necessarily have to do that. It's always great to keep the mana up to bluff, an instant speed card, to then just have it be a land. I mean, it's bluffing, but it's part of the game, and like having more than enough land, having 40 land, which is enough land, allows you to play that part of the game as well. Because it is, because it's a game where you don't have perfect information, you don't know what your opponents are holding, keeping that information for yourself of what you have is part of the game. And it's a thing that I always forget, where I'm like, oh yeah, like my opponents don't know that I have in hand.
Well, exactly. And I mean, given the options, do you want to run less land? Because less land means that either that one of two things happens. One, you have just enough land to do what you need, or you don't have enough.
Right.
Or you can play 40, where you'll have just enough land to do what you need, or you'll have extra. Extra means nobody knows what the heck you're doing with the rest of that land, if you can do something else with that land. So you've always got more options. I'm going to take that every time. But Andy, I noticed the time. I think we probably should be heading to a commercial break, and then when we come back,
it's the perfect time for that.
Yes, and when we come back, we can talk about some of the lands in particular, some lands with some drawbacks,
Lands-a-palooza,
and to sort of have a little chat, get out from under the numbers.
Sir lands a lot.
There we go.
All right, we'll be right back.
If you want a better buy, go see Ral. For the guy who satisfies, go see Ral. Get a gold encrusted knife, and it will extend your life. Go see Ral, go see Ral, go see Ral. Hi, Ral Zarek here. I'm going to show you a painless way to get that amazing piece of equipment you've been looking for. For only 200 Zebs down and 28 Zebs per month, you can get that amazing blade you've always wanted. Or, for no money down, I'll lease it to you for 35 Zebs per month. All our financing goes through the Orzhov Syndicate, so you know you're getting the best deal around. At these prices, you need to get down to Zarek's Used Equipment Emporium before they're all gone. Go see Ral, go see Ral, go see Ral. So, with the second half, or last third, however much we decide,
this last section,
this last part.
However, it falls into editing.
I wanted to talk about Enter the Battlefield tap lands. How many of them should you be looking at in your deck, if any, and sort of trying to get a sense of just how good or bad they are. I mean, for me, I've always run ETB tap lands, just because they've always been less expensive, and I mean dollar wise, and it just sort of made sense. And when I started playing, you either had original duels or you had invasion duels, which were just enter the battlefield tapped, can tap for either color. And you made the decision whether that was worth it to have a land that didn't give you any mana for a turn. And then when it did, it could give you both. Or it could give you two different colored mana.
I think it's crazy how much variety we have for the instances where it can come in untapped.
We now have so many options that, quite honestly, if you're playing a land that enters the battlefield tapped and offers no bonus whatsoever for doing that, you might want to take a look at things. I appreciate, as somebody who ran those, I get it, but there are others that are relatively inexpensive that will give you something.
I will also say with that, like, if you do end up playing with those, after a few games with it, look at what you're usually tapping it for. Chances are you can just replace it with a basic of that color. If you're playing like a 2-color deck.
Yeah, one of those colors.
Right. Because I like, there have been so many times where I'm like, oh, a Guildgate, okay. And then I'm like tapping like a Boros Guildgate for red all the time. And I'm like, oh, I'll just put a mountain in instead. And it comes in untapped.
Right.
Beautiful.
And a big part of that is just simply, I guess, look at your devotion counts. Look at how heavy your cards lean towards one color or the other. When you determine how many lands or what kind of lands go in your deck, you really should be looking at the number of colors,
pips,
the number of pips on your cards. And if you're running black-white, but your black cards have 3 black pips and your white cards generally only have 1 or sometimes 2, you're going to want more black.
Yeah, definitely.
And it doesn't, even if you've got fewer black cards in the deck, the demand for it is that much higher, so you may want to go that route.
But also with the inverse of that, like, you also want to see how early you're playing these cards.
Right.
Command the Dreadhorde, I will bring up again. You have 2 black pips in.
Yeah.
But if you're playing a lot of white cards early in the game, that kind of counterbalances the amount of white that you're putting in.
Right. And when you're talking about a card that costs that much, whether it's 2 black pips or 3 black pips, really makes no difference. If it's a 2-color deck, by the time you have enough mana to cast the card, you're going to have at least 3 black mana. It's not going to be an issue, so you shouldn't worry about it too much. It's the 4 mana card that requires 2 black. Those are the ones you're really looking at, because you need to have that black mana that early. So you really do want to look. But there again, when it comes to an enter the battlefield tap land, and we've mostly been talking about duels, I'm even talking about some of the single color lands that Wizards has been producing lately. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? And to me, a big part about whether deciding whether or not the land is worth it is looking at your meta and realizing how often you get to tap that land. If your meta is running games where the average game goes 10 turns, because, math is hard and I'm going to choose 10. 10 turns. Well, if I play that into the battlefield tap land on the first turn, it means that 9 out of 10 turns, I'm going to get to tap it for mana. And 1 turn, I'm not. Okay, so that means 90% of the time, I'm going to get to use it. If you're in a meta, much like ours, where games are going to go 15 turns, well, now you're only missing it 1 out of 15 turns. Now, yeah, I know, I'm looking at it as though you're playing it on turn 1. What happens when you get it on turn 4 or turn 5? And then you get, the punishment for playing it. It feels like it.
Maybe
it feels like it hurts a little harder, because You know,
Right.
if your fourth land is a land that comes into play tapped, then in theory you're not getting 4 mana on turn 4. You're only getting 3, and that can hurt. So maybe your meta is slow enough that it makes sense to use an enter the battlefield tap land. Maybe the benefit that the card offers is so good that it's worth it. You get or you can look at some of the duels. Like there's the duels that you can cycle for 2 mana that come into play tapped. Well, okay, so
if you are on that turn 5 or 6 and you have it, and you're like, I don't actually have to play this. I can cycle it to get something else.
Right.
You're still losing that mana, but you're also
right. And if you're looking at it on turn 8 and saying to yourself, we've only got 2 more turns. I'm going to play this, and it's going to enter the battlefield tapped. And then next turn, I'm going to get to tap it. So I'm going to get to tap this thing once for 1 mana. Is that better than spending 2, cycling it, and drawing the extra card? That's something to consider as well. And obviously, take each of the benefits as they come. I mean, I'm still running like a Akum Refuge and tap lands that give me 3 life. Not necessarily because I think that that's worth it. It's because I like having duels. Ooh.
Got our first first guest of the podcast.
Yes, the rest of
Frankie.
Yes, the rest of the folks at home missed out on Frankie, but
sorry, literally everyone in the Magic community. We finally have our first guest.
Yeah,
you'll never guess who it was.
Andy's cat.
It was my cat.
So where was I? Hey, Frankie.
I feel like with a lot of those enter the battlefield tapped, as long as like the bonus is literally anything, it's sometimes worth it. I mean, all of the temples come into play. You get to scry.
Yeah.
If you're in a position where that is worth it, then great, play them.
Right. And I've just in my balance, I've decided that the temples are worth it. I will run the appropriate colored temple in virtually any deck that can run it. I'm willing to go without the land to get the scry 1. Maybe that's wrong, but if it's wrong, I don't want to be right.
Ones that I've cut out are like the ones where it comes in tapped and you gain a life. Like it's a little.
So it just take a look at what the land offers as the benefit. Consider your meta when trying to decide how long this is going to go, and then and make your decision from there. I try and make an effort to not put too many enter the battlefield tap lands. I don't want to be that guy who plays his second land on turn 2, but still only has 1 mana available.
Yeah,
and then plays the third land on turn 3, but still only has 2 mana available. I don't want to be running 1 mana behind just because I chose so many enter the battlefield tap lands. But
right. And I feel like, I mean, even to the extent of you've got the Ravnica duels that come in and you have to bounce a land, but they tap for 2 mana. That does, like, it's so weird because it took me so long to like understand this. It doesn't ramp you at all. You still are tapping the same amount of mana per turn, but now you have a land that taps for 2.
Yeah,
which is great in decks that multiply your mana per land tapped. Any deck that you can untap lands.
Decks where the land where you have enter the battlefield.
Right.
Lands that can do that effect.
If you've used up your what are they called? The filter, or not the filter lands, the ones with the
the ones that put the counters on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The counter lands. There we go. Like there are obviously situations where they are great, but I have caught myself using them less and less because I could just be running a basic or a different duel.
Yeah. See, and I have treated them much like the idea of no downside duels.
Mm.
Because you're getting a land that gives you both colors in this case,
right?
Instead of just the one. So that's sort of how I've treated them. But I can understand if you're looking for other options. The other land that I wanted to talk about was one of my personal favorites.
You have a favorite land?
Yes, I do.
How weird can you be?
Temple of the False God.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it should. I love Temple of the False God, and I am one of few who do.
If you are 26 episodes into this podcast, 26, yeah. If you're 26 episodes into this podcast and don't know what Temple of the False if you don't know what Temple of the False God is, it's a land that says if you control, or it's a land that says tap to add 2 colorless mana. You can only activate this ability if you have 5 or more lands, which, by the way, it counts itself. So if you were unclear of our stance on this card, we named our podcast after it. So
let me just go through the complaints about Temple of the False God. The problem that most people have with it is that too many times you draw it and it sits in your hand, or you play it and it doesn't tap for mana because you don't have 5 land. And that is miserable. That makes Temple of the False God sound like a land that should never get played. Because if you're playing a card from your hand and it effectively does nothing, why is it there? Then you should not be running it in your deck. And so this was happening to a lot of people a lot.
Yeah, and I think that it's like the perfect case of using the things that we've learned this episode to kind of understand when to play it. Like, I mean, obviously, your 5th land, play it.
Yeah. But that's exactly right. The problem wasn't with Temple of the False God being a bad land. The problem was you were building your deck wrong. You weren't look, if you have less than 40 lands in your deck, the odds of a temple showing up too early are pretty good.
Yeah.
Just because you're relying on these lands. The odds of finding a 5th land exactly when you needed it were not great because you were playing fewer lands.
The kind of like conundrum that most people have are like, well, if I have it in my opening hand and I only have like 2 other lands, like what if I don't get those 3rd and 4th land drops? And it's like, well, don't play it in your opening hand. Like just mulligan it. Like
well, exactly, and that's the other point.
Yeah. Don't consider it a land in your opening hand. If you're mulliganing and you have, you mulled to 6, and you've got 2 lands, Temple of the False God, and 3 other cards, or I guess you'd have 4 other cards because you put 1 on the bottom. But in that case, you're not going to look at it and be like, I have 3 lands. You're going to look at it and say, I have 2 lands. This card that will help me if I have 2 more lands. And then cards that aren't lands, then throw it back. It's not worth it.
Yeah. You cannot treat Temple of the False God as a land if you've drawn it in your opening hand. Consider what you're going to mulligan. I mean, it's going to be a dead land.
Right.
Because
consider it a 4-drop, honestly. Like,
well, yes. Right. And, forget that it's there. Now look at your hand. Now your hand says you have 2 lands. And what? Now, if you've got some other way that's going to get you some ramp, that's going to get you that 3rd land, and then maybe you only need to draw another land in the next 3 draws, then in theory, Temple could work for you. But if it becomes, but if you're in a scenario where with what you've got, the Temple is going to be your third land drop or your fourth land drop, maybe it isn't the right time to be holding that card. I will say, as somebody who plays 40 lands in virtually every one of my decks, actually that's not true. I play 40 lands in every one of my decks. I don't even have to say virtually. In every one of my decks, 40 lands, and I play the Temple in, I think, every single one of them. I think. I can't guarantee that. But
in virtually every single one.
In virtually every single one. There we go. If I open I can think of the number of times that I have had to play the Temple of the False God before it was the fifth land. I think that it has been a land that I've played before the fifth land once. Out of all the games I've played. And since that time, I would say that I've played 150, maybe 200 games. And that's because I mulligan appropriately, and I'm running 40 land.
Yeah. And I feel like even the few numbers, I mean, I do have more decks with fewer lands than you. And I think I run Temple of the False God in also all of them. And I may have had, in the past 3 years, let's say 3 or 4 times that I've had to play it before my fifth land.
Right, and that's because you've mulliganed appropriately.
And I'm getting mana screwed, and that is not a problem with the card. That is a different problem entirely. I'm playing too few lands.
Right.
But to keep that percentage low, 40 is that sweet spot of not playing too many lands, but being able to play the rest of your cards, including Temple of the False God.
So, yeah, if you are running in a very high-speed meta, maybe Temple of the False God isn't good enough for the amount of time that it'll be there. But to say that it's bad because you're drawing it early and you don't have enough other lands, well, that's just a case of you aren't running 40 lands and you didn't mulligan properly.
Mm-hmm.
So, if that's your reason for restricting it, then you need to find another reason.
Yeah, we take offense. It is a very us card. I think it very much defines our meta. It defines our power level strictly by naming the card, being like, this is what we find to be our cornerstone.
Yeah. And it just makes sense. I mean, there's a reason we named ourselves after the card.
Yeah.
The fact that it rhymes with pod probably had something to do with it as well.
So. Oh, definitely. And I think, there are plenty of God cards out there, but I think, this one in particular, it's not an amazing card. I don't think either of us are saying that. Mm-hmm. It does a thing very specifically that we find to be favorable over its detriments.
Right. Right. And I will say that, since the podcast started a year ago, we opted to, not name ourselves after Corona.
The false god herself.
Yeah, well, it just seemed like a real bad time to be naming yourself after a pandemic. So,
yeah, well,
Andy,
I think that's going to do it.
I think so.
Play 40 lands. Play Temple of the False God if you want.
And mulligan appropriately.
I think that's the biggest thing. Yeah. So thank you for coming. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, our TA Bruce, for putting together this presentation today.
I'm happy to help. Sorry, I left my my visual materials at home.
we will be back next week with a new episode, as always, on Wednesdays that we do that thing we do. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. We are Temple of False...
Pod.
We are Temple of False Pod, where our decks are not optimized, but our plays sure as heck are fun. I'm Andy.
I'm Bruce.
Have a great night, and may your fifth land be the temple.
Bye.